Cold War. During, during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union fought together as allies against the Axis powers. However, the relationship between the two nations was a tense one. Americans had long been wary of the Soviet communism and concerned about Russian leaders. Joseph Stalin's bloodthirsty ruler as his own country. For their part, the Soviets resented the Americans' dedicated long refusal to treat the USSR as a legitimate part of the an international community, as well as their delayed entry into World War II, which resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of Russians. However, the war ended these grievances, ripening into overwhelming sense of mutual distrust and humanity. Power wars, Soviet expansionism in Eastern Europe fueled many Americans' fears of Russian plan to control the world. Meanwhile, the USSR came to resent what they perceived as American officials. Orange built up an interventionist approach to international relations in such a hostile atmosphere. No single party was entirely to blame for the Cold War. In fact, some historians believed it was inevitable. By the time World War II ended, most American officials agreed that the best defense against the Soviet threat was a strategy called Continental. In 1946, in his famous long-term telegram, the diplomat George Kennan expanded this policy. The Soviet Union, he wrote, was a political force committed to the belief that the U.S. there could be no permanent agreement between parties that disagree. Americans' only choice was long-term, patient but firm and vigilant commitment of Russian expansion. President Harry Truman agreed it must be the policy of the United States, he declared before Congress in 1947, to support free people who are resisting attempts by outside pressure. This way of thinking was shaped American foreign policies for the next 4 decades. The commitment strategy also provided the rationale for the orange buildup in the United States in 1950. A National Security Council report known as the NSC 68 has echoed Truman's recommendation that the country use military force to contain communist expansion anywhere. It seemed to be an outcome to the end that the report called for the four-fold increase in defense spending. Particularly, American officials encouraged the development of atomic weapons, like this one that had ended in World War II. This began a deadly arms race. In 1949, the Soviets tested an atom bomb of their own in response. President Truman announced that the United States would build an even more destructive atom weapon, the hydrogen bomb or the super bomb. Followed suit. As a result, the stakes of the Cold War were high. The first H bomb tested in the stakes of the Cold War. Marshall Islands showed just how fearsome the nuclear age could be. It created a 25 square mile fireball that vaporized an island, blew a huge hole in the ocean floor, and had the power to destroy half of Manhattan. Subsequently, Americans and the Soviets tested spewed poison radioactive waste into the atmosphere. The ever-present threat of the nuclear had a great impact on Americans' domestic life as well. People built bomb shelters in their backyard. They practiced attack drills in schools and other public places. The 1950s and 1960s saw an epidemic of popular film that horrified moviegoers with descriptions of nuclear devastation and mutant creatures. And the other ways the Cold War was constant presence in Americans' everyday lives. Almost as soon as he took office, President Richard Nixon began to implement a new approach in the international relations. Instead of viewing the world as a hostile bipolar place, he suggested why not use democracy instead of military actions to create more poles. To that end, he encouraged the United States to be recognized the communist Chinese government, and after a trip, he encouraged the United States to organize. In 1942, began to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. At this time, he adopted a policy of relaxation toward the Soviet Union in 1972, and the Soviet Premier Leonid signed the Strategic Arms Treaty.